In the years immediately following the First World War, the world moved as though it were holding its breath. The guns had fallen silent, but the silence itself felt uncertain, almost provisional. Across Europe and far beyond it, societies tried to return to ordinary rhythms: work, family, trade, politics, yet the memory of mass death and industrial destruction lingered quietly beneath daily life. The war had ended, but it had not truly resolved the tensions that had produced it. The treaties that followed, most notably the Treaty of Versailles, were shaped by exhaustion and fear rather than reconciliation. Victorious nations sought security through limitation and punishment, while defeated states were asked to accept responsibility for a catastrophe that had touched every corner of the globe. Borders were redrawn, empires dissolved, and new nations appeared on maps where none had existed before. For many, these changes promised self-determination and hope. For others, they brought humiliation, economic strain, and a sense of injustice that would not fade easily. Germany, stripped of territory, burdened with reparations, and constrained militarily, became a symbol of this unresolved peace. The treaty was intended to prevent future war, yet it planted the idea that peace itself had been imposed rather than agreed upon. In Eastern Europe, new states struggled to define themselves amid ethnic complexity and weak institutions. In the former territories of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, old loyalties clashed with new political realities, creating fragile arrangements that required constant balancing. Beyond Europe, the consequences were no less significant. Japan emerged from the war strengthened, having expanded its influence in Asia, while the United States stepped briefly into a position of global leadership before retreating again into cautious distance. The League of Nations was formed with the hope that diplomacy might replace violence, yet its authority rested on cooperation rather than enforcement. It functioned more as an aspiration than a guarantee, reflecting a widespread desire for peace without a shared willingness to defend it. At the human level, the war left deep marks. Millions of veterans returned home, carrying physical wounds or memories that shaped how they viewed authority, sacrifice, and national purpose. Families mourned quietly, and entire generations grew up with stories of trenches, hunger, and loss woven into everyday conversation. The belief that progress naturally led toward peace had been shaken, replaced by a quieter, more uncertain outlook on the future. Even in moments of stability during the 1920s, there was an underlying sense that the international system rested on fragile foundations. Economic recovery was uneven, political systems were strained, and faith in democratic compromise was far from universal. Many nations were at peace, but few felt truly secure. The world had survived one global war, yet it had not learned how to prevent another. As this uneasy calm settled in, the forces shaping the next chapter were already at work, sometimes visible, sometimes barely noticed. The decisions made in these years, and the assumptions quietly accepted, would influence how nations responded when pressure returned. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conditions that made another global conflict possible began to take shape. As the world moved deeper into the 1920s, daily life in many places appeared to stabilize. Cities rebuilt, industries resumed production, and international trade slowly recovered. Beneath this surface calm, however, economic systems remained fragile, and political confidence was thin. Prosperity was unevenly distributed, and in many societies, the memory of hardship made optimism cautious rather than assured. Stability existed, but it depended on conditions that could shift without warning. That shift came with startling speed at the end of the decade. The global economic collapse that began in 1929 spread across continents, unsettling nearly every nation connected to the world economy. Banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment reached levels that reshaped how people understood security and dignity. For many, the crisis was not simply financial. It was a profound disruption of trust in institutions that had promised order and progress. In countries already burdened by war debt and reparations, the effects were especially severe. Germany's economy, reliant on foreign loans and fragile confidence, collapsed under the strain. Inflation, unemployment, and social despair created an environment in which moderate political voices struggled to be heard. Similar pressures affected other parts of Europe, where democratic systems were young and lacked deep roots. Economic fear translated easily into political radicalism, as people searched for explanations that could make sense of sudden loss. Extremist ideologies offered simple answers in a complex world. Fascism in Italy, already established under Benito Mussolini, presented itself as a solution built on order, national pride, and unity through authority. In Germany, National Socialism grew from a fringe movement into a mass political force, promising restoration, strength, and revenge against perceived humiliation. These ideologies did not emerge in isolation. They fed on anxiety, resentment, and the belief that traditional politics had failed to protect ordinary people. Elsewhere, different responses took shape. In the Soviet Union, the state pursued rapid industrialization under strict centralized control, presenting itself as an alternative model to capitalist instability. In the United States, democratic institutions endured, but only through deep reforms and expanded government intervention. Each society reacted according to its own history and pressures, yet all were shaped by the same underlying uncertainty about the future of the global system. The economic crisis also weakened international cooperation. Nations turned inward, raising tariffs and protecting domestic industries at the expense of global trade. This fragmentation reduced trust between states and undermined the spirit of collaboration that institutions like the League of Nations depended upon. As cooperation declined, the idea of solving problems through shared sacrifice became increasingly distant. By the mid-1930s, the world was no longer simply recovering from a war. It was adapting to a new atmosphere of competition and ideological division. Economic pain had transformed political landscapes, and the appeal of strong leadership grew where patience had worn thin. The crisis did not force war directly, but it quietly altered the choices available to nations and the values they prioritized. As economies struggled and societies searched for stability, power began to concentrate in new ways. Governments tested limits, citizens adjusted expectations, and the balance established after the First World War continued to erode. What followed would not arrive suddenly, but through a series of deliberate steps that reshaped the world once more. As the 1930s progressed, the international order created after the First World War grew increasingly strained. The agreements that had once promised stability now appeared inflexible in a world defined by rapid change and rising ambition. Nations, dissatisfied with their position, began to test boundaries, often cautiously at first, measuring how far they could go without provoking a decisive response. Each such test subtly altered expectations about what was permitted and what might be tolerated. In Germany, the rise of Adolf Hitler marked a decisive shift in direction. Once in power, His government moved quickly to dismantle the restrictions imposed by the post-war treaties. Rearmament began quietly and then openly, framed as a necessary step toward national recovery and dignity. Military service was restored, weapons production expanded, and the language of renewal became central to public life. These actions challenged the existing order, yet responses from other powers were hesitant, shaped by fear of another devastating war and uncertainty about how far confrontation should go. Italy pursued its own path of expansion, seeking to revive the image of a powerful Mediterranean empire. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 demonstrated a willingness to use force beyond Europe and revealed the limitations of collective security. International condemnation followed, but practical resistance was limited. This episode reinforced a growing perception that aggressive action, if taken carefully, might succeed without meaningful consequences. In Asia, Japan faced pressures of its own. Rapid population growth, limited natural resources, and economic disruption encouraged expansionist thinking. Military leaders gained influence, advocating control over neighboring territories as a solution to domestic vulnerability. The occupation of Manchuria in the early 1930s and the subsequent withdrawal from international oversight signaled a departure from cooperative diplomacy. Conflict in China deepened, drawing the region into prolonged violence well before war spread elsewhere. Meanwhile, democratic powers struggled to define their role. Britain and France, still shaped by the memory of immense loss, prioritized stability and negotiation. Their leaders hoped that limited concessions might satisfy revisionist demands and preserve peace. This approach, later described as appeasement, was not driven by weakness alone, but by a genuine belief that compromise could prevent catastrophe. Yet each concession carried the risk of encouraging further demands. Smaller nations watched these developments with growing unease. As powerful states rearmed and asserted influence, the security of those caught between them became increasingly uncertain. Alliances shifted, treaties were reconsidered, and neutrality appeared less reliable as a long-term strategy. The sense that force was once again becoming a legitimate tool of policy spread quietly across diplomatic circles. By the late 1930s, the language of cooperation had not disappeared, but it competed with a more assertive vision of national destiny. Parades, speeches, and symbols emphasized strength and unity, while military planning became central to state priorities. The world was not yet at war, but it was moving steadily toward confrontation. These years did not feel dramatic in every moment. Life continued, agreements were signed, and peace was officially maintained. Yet beneath these outward signs, the balance of power was being reshaped. With each decision, the space for peaceful resolution narrowed, setting the stage for events that would soon unfold with unstoppable momentum. By the end of the 1930s, the tension that had been building for years reached a point where restraint could no longer hold it in place. Diplomatic efforts continued, but they now unfolded against a background of mobilization and expectation. Governments prepared not only for negotiation, but for the possibility that words would soon fail. The international system, already weakened, stood on the edge of decisive change. The immediate trigger came in Eastern Europe, a region shaped by fragile borders and unresolved grievances. Germany's demands regarding Poland followed earlier territorial expansions that had met little resistance. Agreements had been made and broken, assurances given and quietly set aside. When negotiations collapsed, the remaining balance vanished quickly, In September 1939, German forces crossed into Poland, employing a rapid, coordinated style of warfare designed to overwhelm resistance before it could fully organize. This approach, later known as blitzkrieg, combined speed, surprise, and concentrated force. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry operated together in a way that challenged traditional military thinking. Polish defenses, courageous but unevenly equipped, struggled to respond. Within weeks, the country was divided and occupied, not only by Germany from the west, but also by the Soviet Union from the east, following a secret agreement that revealed the extent to which power politics had returned to the center of international affairs. Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, fulfilling commitments made to Poland. Yet, the declaration did not immediately lead to large-scale fighting in the West. A period of relative quiet followed, sometimes called the Phony War, during which armies faced one another across borders without major engagement. This pause reflected hesitation, unpreparedness, and the lingering hope that conflict might still be contained. For civilians, the outbreak of war marked a sudden shift in atmosphere. Blackouts, rationing, and evacuation plans became part of daily life. The possibility of aerial bombardment brought the front lines into cities and homes, altering the relationship between war and society. Even where fighting had not yet reached, the awareness of vulnerability reshaped routines and expectations. Politically, the invasion of Poland confirmed that earlier attempts to manage aggression through compromise had failed. Trust between states eroded further, and neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Nations were forced to reconsider their positions, aware that distance alone offered little protection in a rapidly shrinking world. The collapse of Poland was not merely a military event. It was a signal that the structures designed to prevent another global war no longer held authority. Agreements, norms, and institutions had been tested and found insufficient. What followed would not be a limited conflict, but a struggle that expanded step by step, drawing in regions and peoples far beyond its original boundaries. As winter settled over Europe, the war entered a new phase, one defined by anticipation and uncertainty. The fighting had begun, yet its full scale remained unseen. The decisions made in the months ahead would determine how widely and how deeply the conflict would spread, and how profoundly it would reshape the world. In the months that followed the initial outbreak of war, daily life across much of Europe existed in a state of uneasy suspension. Armies mobilized, factories adjusted to wartime production, and governments prepared their populations for sacrifice. Though large-scale fighting had not yet reached every region, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. War was no longer a distant memory or a looming threat. It had become a condition shaping how societies organized themselves. When combat resumed with full force in the spring of 1940, it unfolded with startling speed. German forces moved westward through the Low Countries, bypassing heavily fortified defenses and exploiting unexpected routes. The strategy relied on coordination and momentum, leaving little time for opponents to adapt. Belgium and the Netherlands were overrun quickly, their neutrality offering no shield against modern warfare. France, long regarded as a major military power, found itself unprepared for the nature of the assault. Defensive planning, rooted in earlier conflicts, failed to account for the pace and flexibility of the new approach. As German units advanced, confusion spread through command structures, and resistance became fragmented. Within weeks, Paris was occupied, and the French government sought an armistice. The fall of France shocked the world, altering perceptions of strength and vulnerability almost overnight. Occupation brought a different kind of war, one fought through control, surveillance, and adaptation. In occupied territories, daily life continued under new authority, shaped by regulations, shortages, and constant uncertainty. Some individuals collaborated in hopes of stability or advantage, while others resisted quietly or openly, accepting personal risk as the price of defiance. These choices were rarely simple and often driven by circumstance rather than ideology. The war also transformed civilian experience through the growing role of air power. Bombing campaigns targeted cities as well as military infrastructure, blurring the line between front lines and home fronts. Fear became part of routine existence, managed through shelters, routines, and communal endurance. Survival depended not only on armies, but on resilience within households and neighborhoods. Britain, now facing the conflict largely alone in Western Europe, prepared for defense. The threat of invasion loomed, and the Battle of Britain unfolded in the skies above towns and fields. Pilots and radar operators became central figures in a struggle defined by endurance rather than swift victory. The ability to withstand sustained pressure proved as important as offensive capability. As occupation spread and resistance took root, the war revealed its capacity to reshape societies from within. Authority, loyalty, and morality were tested under conditions that allowed few clear answers. Total war demanded total adaptation, drawing civilians into its logic whether they wished to be part of it or not. By the end of this phase, the conflict had moved beyond borders and battlefields. It had entered homes, workplaces, and private decisions. The speed of early victories suggested unstoppable momentum, yet the very scale of occupation created new challenges. Beneath the appearance of dominance, forces were gathering that would complicate and eventually alter the direction of the war. As Europe adjusted to a new and unsettling reality, the conflict began to stretch beyond its original boundaries. What had started as a regional war now drew the attention and involvement of distant nations, each weighing its interests against the risks of participation. Even those officially at peace felt the pull of events, as economic ties, security concerns, and shared values made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. The collapse of several European states disrupted global trade and colonial administration. Territories in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia were drawn into the war effort through supply routes, resource extraction, and strategic positioning. Soldiers from across empires found themselves serving far from home, often in environments they had never imagined. The war, though centered in Europe, was steadily becoming global in scope. At sea, control of shipping lanes emerged as a quiet but decisive struggle. Submarines and surface fleets targeted merchant vessels, seeking to cut off supplies and weaken industrial capacity. The Atlantic became a contested space where survival depended on coordination, technology, and endurance. For island nations and overseas empires, the steady flow of goods was essential, making the ocean itself a central battlefield. The United States watched these developments with careful distance. Public opinion remained wary of direct involvement, shaped by memories of the previous war and a desire to avoid foreign entanglements. Yet economic support for nations under threat increased, framed as a means of maintaining stability rather than entering combat. Materials, food, and weapons crossed oceans, binding economies together even as armies remained formally separate. In Asia, fighting continued between Japan and China, consuming resources and attention. The conflict there unfolded with its own rhythms and tragedies, often overlooked by observers focused on Europe. yet it contributed to the broader pattern of escalation, demonstrating how regional wars could persist and deepen alongside larger struggles. Diplomatically, alliances hardened. Agreements were signed that committed nations to shared defense or mutual support, reducing flexibility and narrowing options. Each treaty, each shipment, each strategic decision made the idea of remaining untouched by war more remote. The world was becoming interconnected not only through trade and culture, but through conflict. For civilians in many countries, this period felt like a long wait. Life continued under rationing, censorship, and uncertainty, with the awareness that the war's reach was expanding. News traveled slowly and often incompletely, creating a sense of distance from events that nevertheless shaped daily existence. By the early 1940s, the distinction between war and non-war had begun to blur. Nations that had hoped to observe from the sidelines found themselves drawn closer, their choices constrained by unfolding realities. The conflict had not yet reached its most destructive phase, but its direction was clear. Forces were aligning, resources were mobilizing, and the path toward a truly global war was becoming impossible to reverse. In the summer of 1941, the war entered a phase that reshaped its scale and character more profoundly than any event since its beginning. After months of preparation and secrecy, German forces turned eastward, launching a vast invasion of the Soviet Union. The decision was rooted in ideology, strategy, and long-standing ambition, yet it also reflected a belief that speed and force could once again secure victory before resistance fully formed. The invasion unfolded along a front stretching hundreds of miles, involving millions of soldiers and immense quantities of equipment. Initial advances were rapid, repeating patterns seen elsewhere. Entire Soviet formations were encircled, and large territories fell in a matter of weeks. To outside observers, it appeared as though the campaign might end quickly, reinforcing the impression that momentum favored the attackers. For the Soviet Union, the invasion was both a military shock and a societal rupture. The scale of the assault demanded immediate mobilization of resources, people, and political will. Factories were dismantled and moved eastward, beyond the reach of advancing forces. Civilians were evacuated, often under extreme conditions, carrying little more than what they could hold. The war became inseparable from survival itself. The conflict on this front was defined by extremes. Geography alone imposed challenges, vast distances, limited infrastructure, and harsh seasonal changes. As summer turned to autumn and then winter, weather slowed movement and strained supply lines. What had been planned as a swift campaign evolved into a prolonged struggle shaped as much by endurance as by tactics. Ideology intensified the violence. The war in the East was fought not only for territory, but for visions of how societies should exist. This framing stripped away restraints and contributed to widespread brutality. Civilians found themselves trapped between advancing armies, occupation policies, and shifting front lines. Villages and cities became battlegrounds, their populations exposed to hunger, displacement, and fear. Despite early losses, Soviet resistance hardened. Command structures adapted, new leaders emerged, and the immense depth of territory allowed time for reorganization. The defense of key cities took on symbolic importance, representing not only strategic positions, but the survival of the state itself. The conflict became a test of whether an entire society could absorb shock without collapsing. For soldiers on both sides, the Eastern Front altered the meaning of war. Combat was continuous, conditions were severe, and losses were staggering. The idea of a clear front dissolved into a landscape of movement and counter-movement, where progress was measured in exhausted steps rather than decisive victories. As winter set in, the assumption of a quick resolution faded. The invasion had opened the largest and most destructive front of the war, committing both sides to a struggle that would consume resources and lives on an unprecedented scale. The outcome remained uncertain, but the character of the war had changed permanently, setting in motion forces that would shape everything that followed. As the war on the Eastern Front settled into its relentless rhythm, it became clear that this was not a conflict defined by swift campaigns or clean victories. Instead, it unfolded as a prolonged struggle of exhaustion, shaped by ideology, environment, and the limits of human endurance. Time itself became a weapon, pressing equally on soldiers, civilians, and commanders who faced decisions with consequences measured in survival rather than strategy alone. Life for civilians in occupied and contested regions was marked by constant uncertainty. Cities changed hands, supply lines collapsed, and normal social structures eroded under the weight of scarcity. Hunger became widespread, particularly in besieged urban centers where access to food was deliberately restricted. Survival depended on improvisation, community support, and often sheer luck. Daily routines revolved around securing warmth, nourishment, and safety, while the broader course of the war remained distant and abstract. For soldiers, the front offered little relief. Combat was continuous, with few clear pauses between engagements. Defensive lines shifted gradually, sometimes only a few miles at great cost. Weather intensified hardship, with extreme cold and heat-testing equipment and morale alike. Weapons failed, medical supplies ran thin, and rest was rare. The landscape itself, fields, forests, ruined villages, absorbed the marks of sustained fighting, becoming both shelter and threat. Ideological pressure remained ever present. Propaganda framed the conflict as existential, leaving little room for compromise or retreat. This framing influenced conduct on the battlefield and beyond it, contributing to harsh policies toward prisoners and civilians. The line between military necessity and punishment blurred, deepening the cycle of violence. Individual choices were constrained by orders, fear, and the belief that defeat would mean destruction. Yet within this environment, adaptation slowly took place. Commanders learned from early failures, adjusting tactics and logistics. Industrial production increased, supplying vast numbers of weapons and vehicles despite ongoing losses. Training improved, coordination strengthened, and experience accumulated. The war became less about surprise and more about sustaining pressure over time. Key battles took on symbolic significance, not only for their strategic value but for what they represented. The defense of major cities came to embody resilience, reinforcing the idea that survival itself could be a form of victory. These moments did not end the war, but they altered its direction, proving that collapse was not inevitable. For those living through it, the Eastern Front was not experienced as a single narrative, but as a series of long days marked by fatigue and waiting. News of victories or defeats filtered slowly, often distorted by distance and censorship. What mattered most was the immediate present. The next meal, the next order, the next night endured. As the months passed, the balance began to shift, almost imperceptibly. The immense strain placed on attacking forces met a resistance that grew steadier with time. Without a clear turning point, the war in the East began to favor endurance over speed, and in that slow adjustment, The foundations were laid for changes that would soon echo far beyond this front. While vast armies clashed across continents, another struggle unfolded quietly and persistently across the world's oceans and skies. This was a war less visible to civilians, yet no less decisive. Control of sea routes and airspace determined whether nations could feed their populations, supply their armies, and sustain the long effort that modern war demanded. Victory here was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in continuity. At sea, the conflict revolved around movement and denial. Merchant ships carried food, fuel, and raw materials across vast distances, forming lifelines between industrial centers and distant fronts. Disrupting these routes became a strategic priority. Submarines hunted beneath the surface, relying on stealth and patience, while surface fleets guarded convoys through contested waters. Each crossing carried risk, and each successful delivery represented a quiet triumph of coordination and endurance. The Atlantic, in particular, became a prolonged test of logistics and technology. Long stretches of open water offered little protection, and early in the war, defensive measures lagged behind offensive capability. Gradually, new systems emerged: improved detection, coordinated escort tactics, and better communication. These developments did not eliminate danger, but they reduced losses and shifted the balance toward sustainability rather than constant crisis. In the air, warfare evolved rapidly. Aircraft moved from supporting roles to central instruments of strategy. Bombing campaigns sought to weaken industrial capacity and morale, bringing the war directly to urban populations. Air defenses responded with radar, fighter coordination, and civilian preparedness. Nights were punctuated by alarms and the distant sound of engines, shaping a shared experience of waiting and resilience. Air power also transformed battlefields far below. Reconnaissance improved planning, while close support altered how ground forces advanced or defended positions. Control of the skies increasingly determined freedom of movement, making air superiority a prerequisite for major operations. This interdependence blurred distinctions between land, sea, and air, binding them into a single system of warfare. For civilians, the aerial war introduced a new relationship with distance and vulnerability. No longer protected by geography alone, cities became targets, and daily routines adjusted accordingly. Yet over time, societies adapted. Shelters were built, procedures established, and communities learned how to endure disruption without constant panic. The presence of danger became normalized, absorbed into the rhythms of wartime life. These struggles lacked clear beginnings or endings. Convoys sailed, aircraft rose, and losses were recorded quietly, often without immediate recognition. Yet the cumulative effect was profound. Sustained access to resources and information shaped what was possible elsewhere, enabling offensives or preventing collapse. As the war continued, mastery of air and sea did not guarantee victory, but it created the conditions under which victory could be pursued. The ability to move, supply, and observe became as crucial as the ability to fight. And in this patient contest of systems and endurance, the long-term direction of the war began to come into clearer focus. As the conflict matured, its center of gravity expanded decisively into the Pacific, transforming what had already become a global war into a truly interconnected one. The vast distances of ocean and island chains created a different rhythm of fighting, slower in movement, yet intense in consequence. Here, geography dictated strategy, and control of scattered points of land determined access to entire regions. Japan's expansion across East and Southeast Asia had been driven by a desire for security and self-sufficiency. Access to resources such as oil, rubber, and metals was seen as essential to sustaining industrial and military power. As tensions with Western powers deepened, this strategic logic hardened into preparation for confrontation. When open conflict began, it unfolded rapidly, drawing multiple nations into war almost simultaneously. Initial advances brought swift success. Territories fell, and established powers were pushed back, unprepared for the speed and coordination of the assault. For populations across Asia, this shift brought upheaval. Colonial structures collapsed, replaced by new authorities, whose promises and realities often diverged sharply. Civilians faced occupation, displacement, and the uncertainty of changing rule, all while the larger direction of the war remained unclear. The nature of warfare in the Pacific emphasized mobility and adaptation. Naval power played a central role, with aircraft carriers replacing battleships as the decisive instruments of sea control. Battles were fought over vast expanses of water, often without opposing forces ever coming into visual range. Outcomes depended on intelligence, timing, and the ability to project force across distance. Island campaigns introduced a different kind of endurance. Remote locations required self-contained operations, with supply and medical care stretched to their limits. Combat was often close and prolonged, shaped by terrain as much as by tactics. Heat, disease, and isolation became constant companions, testing morale as severely as the enemy itself. For those far from the front, the Pacific War altered perceptions of scale and vulnerability. News traveled slowly, filtered through official reports and personal letters. The war felt both distant and immediate, its consequences measured in resources diverted, alliances reshaped, and futures uncertain. The interconnectedness of events became increasingly apparent, as developments in one theater influenced decisions in another. As resistance grew and counteroffensives began, momentum shifted gradually rather than dramatically. Each regained position represented not a final victory, but a step in a longer process of attrition. The emphasis remained on control, supply, and the careful allocation of strength. By this stage, the war had settled into multiple overlapping struggles, each with its own tempo, but bound together by shared demands on people and production. The Pacific conflict underscored that the war's outcome would not be decided by a single front or moment, but by sustained effort across an interconnected world, an effort that was still unfolding, quietly and relentlessly. As the war extended into its later years, it increasingly became a test not only of armies, but of entire societies. The ability to endure, to adapt, and to sustain effort over time emerged as the quiet foundation beneath every campaign. Factories, laboratories, farms, and households were drawn into a single continuous process of support, linking the outcome of distant battles to everyday routines far from the front. Industrial production reached unprecedented levels. Nations reorganized their economies around the demands of war, converting civilian industries to military purposes and prioritizing efficiency above all else. Assembly lines ran day and night, producing vehicles, aircraft, weapons, and supplies in quantities previously unimaginable. Standardization replaced customization, and speed became as important as precision. This vast output did not guarantee success, but it made prolonged resistance possible. Scientific research took on new urgency. Innovations in medicine improved survival rates for wounded soldiers, while advances in communications and detection reshaped coordination and planning. New materials, fuels, and engineering techniques emerged from the pressure to solve practical problems quickly. These developments were often incremental rather than revolutionary, yet their combined effect steadily altered the balance of capability. The workforce itself changed in composition and expectation. With large numbers of men serving in uniform, women entered roles that had previously been closed to them, becoming central to industrial and administrative life. This shift was not always accompanied by recognition or equality, but it transformed daily experience and expanded ideas about contribution and responsibility. Work became both a necessity and a form of participation in a shared effort. At home, civilian life adjusted to long-term scarcity. Rationing shaped diets, clothing choices, and habits of consumption. People learned to repair rather than replace, to save rather than spend. These routines fostered a sense of collective endurance, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on patience as much as courage. The war became something lived continuously rather than faced in moments of crisis. Morale was carefully managed through information and symbolism. Governments sought to maintain confidence without ignoring hardship, balancing honesty with reassurance. News of victories and losses was framed within a broader narrative of purpose and inevitability. Over time, this narrative helped societies absorb sacrifice without constant unrest, though fatigue was never far below the surface. Despite immense output and organization, the strain was visible. Resources were finite, and coordination across vast distances remained imperfect. Errors, shortages, and inefficiencies persisted, reminding planners that no system could fully escape the limits of human capacity. Yet, the overall direction was clear. The war was increasingly decided by who could sustain effort the longest. As these systems of production and support matured, they created the conditions for large-scale operations that would soon reshape the map of the conflict. The groundwork laid in factories and offices would find its expression on battlefields and coastlines yet to come, carrying the war toward its decisive phase. By the time the war reached this stage, its momentum had begun to shift in ways that were felt more than announced. There was no single moment when the balance clearly tipped, no universal acknowledgement that the outcome had changed. Instead, the shift revealed itself gradually through a series of pressures applied across multiple fronts, each reinforcing the other. What had once been rapid expansion now encountered resistance that could not easily be broken. On land, coordinated offensives began to test the limits of stretched forces. Advances were slower and more deliberate, shaped by experience gained over years of fighting. Planning emphasized depth rather than speed, with careful attention to supply, timing, and mutual support. Success was measured not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by steady progress that reduced the enemy's ability to recover. In the east, sustained pressure pushed front lines westward, though at immense cost. Each regained town or region carried symbolic weight, yet commanders remained cautious, aware of how quickly fortunes could change. The war here continued to demand sacrifice, but it increasingly favored those who could replace losses and maintain cohesion over time. The struggle became one of persistence rather than surprise. In the west and south, new fronts opened or expanded, forcing a redistribution of resources. Defending multiple directions strained coordination and reduced flexibility. Air power intensified, targeting infrastructure and transport networks to limit movement and resupply. These actions rarely produced immediate collapse, but they narrowed options and increased vulnerability. At sea, sustained control of key routes allowed the movement of men and material on a scale that earlier years had not permitted. This logistical confidence enabled complex operations that depended on precise timing and overwhelming support. The ocean, once a space of constant uncertainty, became more predictable, though never entirely safe. For civilians, the changing tide was sensed indirectly. News of advances arrived alongside reports of continued hardship, creating a quiet awareness that the war was moving, even if its end remained distant. Expectations adjusted slowly, shifting from mere survival toward cautious anticipation. Yet fatigue was widespread, and patience was tested by the length of the struggle. The leadership on all sides faced narrowing choices. Strategic decisions carried heavier consequences, and mistakes were harder to absorb. The margin for recovery diminished as resources were consumed and territories lost. Even where resistance remained determined, the overall direction grew harder to reverse. This phase did not bring immediate resolution, but it marked a transition from expansion to defense, from initiative to reaction. The war continued, vast and demanding, yet the sense of inevitability that had once driven aggression began to fade. In its place emerged a quieter understanding that the conflict was entering its final, most demanding stretch, where endurance would be tested one last time. As the war moved into its final stages in Europe, the atmosphere shifted once again, this time toward a slow and unmistakable contraction. The vast ambitions that had once driven expansion now gave way to the practical realities of defense and retreat. Territory that had been gained quickly over years was lost gradually, often at great cost, as pressure closed in from multiple directions. The conflict did not end with a sudden collapse, but with a steady narrowing of options. In the West, advancing forces moved carefully across familiar landscapes, transformed by years of occupation and bombardment. Towns and cities bore the marks of prolonged conflict, their populations caught between relief and uncertainty. Liberation was experienced differently from place to place, sometimes as celebration, sometimes as cautious adjustment to another new authority. The war's end was visible, but its consequences were still unfolding. In the East, fighting remained intense. Even as defeat became likely, resistance continued, driven by discipline, fear, and the weight of what defeat was expected to bring. Entire regions were consumed by movement and counter-movement, with civilians once again displaced as front lines shifted. The scale of destruction left behind reflected not only military necessity, but the accumulated force of years of ideological and material struggle. Within Germany itself, the war reached into daily life with increasing urgency. Air raids intensified, infrastructure failed, and shortages deepened. The sense of isolation grew as allies fell away and communication broke down. For many civilians, the final months were defined less by ideology than by survival, finding shelter, food, and a way through each day as familiar structures dissolved. Leadership decisions in this period were constrained and often desperate. Resources were depleted, coordination faltered, and the capacity to respond effectively diminished. Yet the machinery of war continued to function, sustained by habit and obligation as much as belief. The conflict persisted beyond the point where victory was plausible, prolonging suffering without altering the outcome. When organized resistance in Europe finally ended, it did so unevenly. Surrenders were signed, fighting ceased, and weapons fell silent in stages rather than all at once. For those who had lived through years of war, The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. Peace arrived not as relief alone, but as an open question about how life would be rebuilt. The end of the European War marked a conclusion to one chapter, but not to the conflict as a whole. The systems, alliances, and expectations shaped by years of fighting did not disappear with surrender. As attention shifted elsewhere, the experience of Europe's collapse offered a sobering reflection on the cost of total war, and a reminder that the final resolution had yet to come. While the war in Europe drew to a close, the conflict in the Pacific entered its final and most intense phase. Here, distance did not soften the struggle. Instead, it prolonged it, stretching time and endurance across vast oceans and isolated islands. The fighting had already consumed years, and by now it carried a heavy sense of inevitability, even as resistance remained determined. Advances continued step by step, each one costly and deliberate. Positions were taken not for symbolic value but to limit movement, supply, and communication. The strategy emphasized isolation rather than rapid conquest, reducing the capacity to continue fighting over time. This approach reflected lessons learned through long experience, that endurance and control could achieve what speed alone could not. For those involved directly, the final months were marked by exhaustion. Combat often occurred in confined spaces, under harsh environmental conditions, with little opportunity for rest. Medical care struggled to keep pace, and recovery was uncertain. Yet routines persisted, shaped by discipline and the quiet expectation that the end, however distant, would eventually arrive. Civilians across the region endured prolonged hardship. Shortages deepened, infrastructure deteriorated, and uncertainty shaped every decision. Daily life was governed by adaptation, finding substitutes, conserving resources, and maintaining social bonds under strain. The war's presence was constant, not always through direct violence, but through its steady erosion of normalcy. As the conflict approached its conclusion, scientific and military developments converged in ways that reshaped expectations about the future. New forms of destructive power were introduced, altering not only the immediate course of the war, but how humanity understood the limits of warfare itself. The impact was sudden and decisive, bringing an abrupt end to prolonged uncertainty. The cessation of fighting did not feel like triumph everywhere. For many, it arrived as shock, followed by silence. The transition from war to peace was immediate in name, yet incomplete in experience. Loss, displacement, and memory did not vanish with the signing of documents or the lowering of flags. The end of the Pacific War closed the final chapter of a global conflict that had touched nearly every region and society. Yet even as weapons were set aside, the implications of how the war had ended lingered. New questions emerged quietly about power, responsibility, and the future of international relations. These questions would shape the world that followed, just as deeply as the war itself had shaped those who lived through it. When the war finally ended, the world did not return to what it had been before. Silence followed years of noise, but it was not an empty silence. It was filled with movement, of people returning home, of borders shifting, of societies trying to understand what had happened and what now lay ahead. The conclusion of fighting marked an ending, yet it also opened a long and uncertain beginning. Across continents, cities lay damaged or destroyed, their streets bearing the physical imprint of sustained conflict. Rebuilding became both a practical necessity and a symbolic act. Infrastructure had to be restored, homes repaired, and economies restarted, often with limited resources and exhausted populations. Reconstruction was slow, uneven, and shaped by the same inequalities that had existed before the war, now amplified by loss. Millions of people were displaced. Former soldiers, prisoners, and civilians uprooted by fighting or policy faced the challenge of finding a place in societies that had changed during their absence. For some, return was possible. For others, home no longer existed in any meaningful sense. These movements reshaped demographics and introduced new tensions, quietly influencing political and social life for decades to come. The war also transformed the structure of global power. Nations that had emerged, strengthened, took on new responsibilities and influence, while others faced the task of redefining themselves after defeat or occupation. International cooperation was reimagined, informed by the recognition that isolation and rivalry had led to catastrophe. New institutions were formed with the intention of managing conflict more effectively, reflecting both hope and caution. At a human level, memory became a defining force. Those who had lived through the war carried experiences that resisted easy explanation. Some spoke openly, others remained silent, yet the presence of the past shaped family life, culture, and collective identity. The war was remembered not only through monuments and histories, but through habits, fears, and expectations passed quietly from one generation to the next. Technological and social changes accelerated by the conflict continued into peacetime. Advances in medicine, industry, and communication altered daily life, while shifts in labor and social roles challenged established norms. These changes were not always welcomed, but they reflected a world that could no longer stand still after such upheaval. The legacy of the war was not contained within a single lesson or outcome. It existed in contradictions, in progress born from destruction, in unity forged through division, in peace shaped by memory of violence. The world moved forward carrying both loss and possibility, shaped by what had been endured. And so, as the echoes of war faded, history did not conclude, but flowed onward. The events of those years settled into the foundation of the modern world, influencing decisions, fears, and hopes long after the last battles ended. In that quiet continuation, the story of the war found its final meaning, not as an ending, but as a turning point whose presence would be felt through the long night of history that followed.